discussed, but it escaped Krugman's purview. I quote from another mainstream economist who was talking really publicly about the role of the Fed that in ways that everyone was more or less reflecting. Jeffrey Sachs, professor of economics at Columbia University, by no means an economist I have enormous admiration for, but at least he wrote clearly at one point in the Financial Times, the US crisis was actually made by the Fed. The Fed pumped money into the US economy and slashed its main rate, the federal funds rate, from 3.5% in August 2001 to a mere 1% by mid-2003. The Fed held this rate too low for too long. Monetary expansion generally makes it easier to borrow and lowers the cost of doing so. What was distinctive this time was that the new borrowing was concentrated in housing. Now that's a reasonably good explanation of what happened. It, however, did escape Krugman's purview. I want to elaborate on what Sachs said. I hope you can follow that table. It's simply the phenomenon of negative interest rates. What I did was, in the first column, I took the interest rate on federal funds from 2001 through 2006, and I subtracted the inflation rate. And we find that for 4 straight years, from 02, 03, 04, and 05, we had negative interest rates. This was only the second time in history that there were negative interest rates. The previous time had been the mid-1970s, the high inflation years of the mid-1970s. But this was the second time. And if you ask just a simple question, what banker in his right mind would lend money at below the rate of price inflation? I mean, you know the price is going to go up by 3%, you lend money at 1%? What individual in his or her right mind would lend money at below the rate of inflation? Well, no individual with any common sense. It takes a Federal Reserve to do that. Now, there were other indictments of the Fed by John Taylor. He's author of the Taylor Law. His prescription mainly is that the Fed funds rate should be 1.5 times the inflation rate. Common criticisms of the Fed were being leveled. Greenspan, who was at the time, Alan Greenspan, the Federal Reserve Chairman, the walk-on-water man, had been defending himself for a number of years against the allegations that he was responsible for the bubble. We won't go into his rationalizations unless you're curious in the question and answer period. How was he explaining himself? I'm going to quote only from Ben Bernanke, who is the current Fed chairman, and who was present at the time as well when they set interest rates below the rate of inflation. He was Greenspan's right-hand man on the Federal Reserve Board of Governors, and he's understandably a little touchy about what they did. Now, here's a quote from him in January 2010, defending himself about monetary policy in the housing bubble, and I quote, "Economists," he writes, he said, "who have investigated the issue have generally found that, based on historical relationships, only a small portion of the increase in house prices earlier this decade can be attributed to the stance of U.S. monetary policy." Now, you notice I put the footnote in there, that's number 12. And if you check the footnote, he mentions a couple of studies, these economists who supposedly backed him up, and one of them, in footnote, endnote 12, from 2 economists, Jarosinski and Smets, writing in 2008, and they wrote, "On the contrary, we find that monetary policy has significant effects on housing investment and house prices, and that easy monetary policy designed to stave off perceived risks of inflation in 02 to 04 has contributed to the boom in the housing market in 2004 and 2005. It's amazing in the age of the internet that a prominent official from the Fed would have the temerity to put in an endnote a source that supposedly backs him up that actually directly contradicts him. We're going to have another example of that in a moment. You know, it was hard maybe pre-internet to have the energy to look up people's sources, but these days it's not too difficult. But I guess it's amazing that if the Federal Reserve Chairman is saying this, then nobody questions his sources. But his sources directly contradicted him. So it attribute to some degree of the desperation of Bernanke, and Greenspan was even more desperate, to defend themselves against the obvious point that negative interest rates below the rate of inflation, only the second time in history that this happened, sets the interest rate very low, causes monetary expansion, and helps fuel the housing bubble. Now, I'm only calling that the enabling factor because I'm open to the argument that that negative interest rates can cause different problems, but you need something like a propelling factor. And that propelling factor was the US government's housing policy beginning in 1992. Now, I'm going to begin with another quote, and this is from a University of Chicago finance professor, Raghu Rajan. Now, I find that economics and finance professors from business schools, I'm not the first one to observe this, are generally more sophisticated than economists from conventional economics departments. They're immersed in business, immersed in finance, and they have a sort of a natural sense of the way markets work that's superior to that of the standard mainstream economists. Now, what is Rajan saying? It's a particular quote that I got from him in a column I wrote, about which more in a moment, but he said the following: "The banking sector did not decide out of the goodness of its heart to extend mortgages to poor people. Politicians did that, and they would have taken great umbrage if the regulator stood in the way of more housing credit." Well, we had a massive housing bubble, subprime mortgages, non-traditional mortgages issued in the billions, in the trillions of dollars, and we are supposed to believe that it was all done by bankers, private bankers. It's a failure of capitalism. We'll get to some of the subtleties of that in a moment, but Rajan is saying something fairly simple and he actually comes from a sort of a liberal left viewpoint when he talks. He says, well, they did this because they wanted to remedy the inequality of income that had arisen in the early 1990s. He's trying to make the point that bankers are not philanthropists. Only politicians can be philanthropists and extend mortgages to poor people. I called Rajan up especially because he was featured in a movie called Inside Job. I don't know if anybody saw it. It was a documentary film that won the Oscar for Best Documentary, following in the great tradition of Michael Moore and Al Gore, who had also done sort of semi-fictional documentaries on various subjects. Inside Job, Rajan was in the movie, and he's actually famous because he was one of the few economists at the time who anticipated the bubble, and he's sort of celebrated in the film. But he's quoted in a very, very limited fashion. And when I spoke to him, I said, have you seen Inside Job? And when I told him a little bit about how it depicted him and the basic story, he was somewhat surprised. Because if Charles Ferguson, who did the movie Inside Job, had actually quoted Rajan at any length, he would have found that Rajan's view of what really went on is totally different from the way the movie portrays it. So that's Rajan talking. And I think basically making sense. And let's begin with another slightly long quote from 1992, Title 13 Housing and Community Development Act, because this is really the beginning. It started in the early 90s, that there was an enormous push to push the old-time religion of home ownership on poor people. An amazingly naive idea was abroad that if you just lowered the interest rate and charged them no down payment, then they could afford to buy a home. And the act that was passed initially mentions Fannie and Freddie, the Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, government-sponsored enterprises that were essentially protected by the federal government, even though they also were publicly traded on the New York Stock Exchange as stocks. Classic sort of crony capitalist organization.